Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our explorations of the cultures of consciousness. And one of those cultures which we talk about not infrequently here on Expanding Mind is the modern culture of psychedelic use. Not the indigenous one, though that comes up, or the indigenous ones, there are so many. But really looking at the modern experience of psychedelics as a very peculiar, wonderful, consternating, and potentially quite liberating zone of consciousness exploration that sort of combines and weaves its way between various different paradigms, neurological paradigms, psychological paradigms, religious, mystical, esoteric paradigms. And in this culture, in fact, one of the things that I think makes it clear that it is an unusual culture, one that has, or multiple cultures, but one that has clear resonances with more traditional societies, even if it's not necessarily itself particularly traditional, is the role of what we can only call elders. That is, the fact that many young people who are enthusiastic about these substances spend a lot of time paying attention to older people who have been around these things for a long time. One can look at, for example, at the way that Sasha Shulgin, who was a wonderful man, a wonderful scientist, and a very pleasant person to be around, someone who was very interested in mentoring younger people, in sharing his wisdom, and in really becoming a kind of model of a way of integrating these experiences, of dealing with the science, of dealing with the psychology, and of showing a kind of healthy way of being in the midst of things that can be very consternating and are, of course, often illegal, and therefore producing its own kind of difficulties. But the role that Sasha had in the community up until his death, and in some sense continuing through his books and his lingering presence, really was one of an elder, and that people would turn to him, listen to him, and really allow themselves to be inspired by him in a way that you don't find in other zones where young people are often more interested in finding out their own their own truths and poo-pooing the generations who came before. So I've always been very interested in this aspect. And our guest today, though he may not, nobody likes being called an elder necessarily. Our guest today is what I would call one of our hidden elders in the psychedelic culture. Bill Richards, who currently works at the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins and was instrumental and deeply involved in the breakthrough studies that Johns Hopkins had surrounding psilocybin and mystical type experiences, which we'll be talking a lot about today. But and Bill's from all accounts a wonderful guy and present. I've never had the chance to meet him, but I do feel like now I've got to know him a lot better through his new book called Sacred Knowledge: Psychedelics and Religious Experiences. And having read through the book, I would say that there's another sense in calling Bill Richards an elder beyond his years, which is that he represents a certain tradition or set of traditions within modern psychedelic culture. And the main term for that tradition is perennialism. It's something we can trace back, we can trace it back to antiquity, but we can trace it back in the modern psychedelic sense to Aldous Huxley, who believed that beneath the varied religious traditions of the world were some core sets of experiences that were shared, universal experiences, and that these experiences could be accessed not only through meditation and prayer and other practices, but through the use of psychedelics. And this notion really influenced a lot of early psychedelic research, and also the sort of increasingly religious or spiritual ideas that people had about these things, both in and outside of the underground. And Bill makes a very strong case for this approach to psychedelics, and we'll be talking about some of the different ways of thinking about that later, since it's not exactly my perspective although I share overall his overall call for the judicious use of these things as an exploration of the human self, of the development of psychology, of dealing with trauma, of dealing with death, and indeed of the spiritual and mystical potential of these things. But there's another tradition that Bill represents, and then I'll shut up and we can begin our conversation, and that is the tradition of people exploring these compounds, being supervisors in supervised situations within medical or psychiatric institutions. And of course, this has been going on since the 1950s. And Bill, as we'll hear, started in 1963. And like Stan Groff, who probably people are more familiar with, he's overseen thousands of psychedelic sessions as either a sort of direct guide or someone involved in the lab and involved in talking with people, integrating their experiences, preparing them from these experiences. And this has to be seen as one of the most important sites of modern psychedelic culture, is what has happened in many ways, in ways that most people aren't that aware of, in these I won't call them laboratory, that sounds too clinical, but these clinical environments that are allowed under the law, and that have evolved their own processes, their own practices, their own protocols, which aren't merely medical or even psychological, but have a distinct spiritual component, particularly in the way that Bill and others have been approaching these things through the lens of what some call primary religious experience. So that's enough of an intro. Bill, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
It's an honor to be with you. I look forward to our conversation, Erik.
Yeah. So I would like to go over a little bit of your history, because, again, I feel like both, within a psychedelic culture and within the sort of psychological culture at large, or culture at large, there's a very little sense of how deep and long-standing and thorough sort of one-on-one guided psychedelic experiences have been within the context of medical or psychiatric institutions. And I know that you've been doing this, you would have been doing it your whole life if they had let you, but you still managed to put in a lot of good years on this. So I just love to hear a little bit about particularly your early experiences in Germany with Dr. Leuner, and your encounters with Walter Pahnke, and that whole sort of initial sense of what could be achieved, what were the questions being asked in these early days of psychedelic psychotherapeutic research.
I'll do my best to give you a brief outline anyway. Once upon a time, I was a 23-year-old graduate student at the University of Göttingen in Germany, Western Germany at that time. Same year Kennedy was assassinated, actually. And in the clinic nearby, they were doing research with some drug called psilocybin I had never heard of, that was alleged to trigger memories from early childhood. And so I asked if I could participate, and went in there expecting some insights into my early Oedipal complex, and instead had a very profound transcendental type of experience, which I didn't even know was possible there. And I remember at the end of the day saying, "And what did you give me? What's the name of that drug? How do you spell it?" And I continued then to work in the clinic there. First, this research project was a series of 4 sessions, and the next 3 were not mystical, interestingly enough. And then Walter Pahnke arrived in Göttingen, and he proposed giving me a slightly higher dose, and I've never been the same since, thank God.
Well, one of the
So I
interesting
began
things about
volunteering.
that period was that, as you said, like when it was when when psilocybin was mentioned, it was that, oh, this drug helps you remember your past. It was as if within the clinical community, the association between psychedelics and religious experience or mystical experience hadn't even really entered the language.
That's right. Hans Karl Lerner had just written a monograph, a very expensive little paperback called The Experimental Psychosa, The Experimental Psychoses. And in that book, there's chapters on perceptual changes and paranoid states and so on. And then there's a little half page about what he called cosmic mystical experiences. And he included it in his book just for comprehensiveness, that every now and then this unusual state of consciousness gets reported. But since in those days, there was no preparation, there was no skilled guidance, there was no use of music. You were just led to a little basement room, given an injection, and left alone. And most people got mildly psychotic. And so it was thought at that time that these drugs might help us understand schizophrenia better, or they might induce a model psychosis. And I had the unique fortune, I guess, of being there at the precise time with Walter Pankey's arrival, that the importance of set and setting were discovered and implemented in Germany. So by the time I had my fifth experiment there, we had moved upstairs to a room with some plants and some light, and we added some music, and Walter was there to provide interpersonal support if I needed it. And the research kind of took off from that point.
Well, I'm really interested in the details, in the practices and protocols that were developed by yourself and by others who you were working with, both in Germany and later in Maryland.
Right. There was a decade at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center before the Hopkins days.
Right, and so that ended in the late 70s, and then Hopkins kind of picked it up again. And there's some mention, you talk extensively about music, which I want to get to in a second. But before that, I'd really just love to hear a little bit about, once you sort of recognize that set and setting are always going to be a factor. I mean, in some sense, there's no escape from set and setting. If you're in a blank hospital room, your setting is a blank hospital room, and that's going to have an effect. If you're in a nice room with light and flowers, that nice light and flowers are going to have, to some degree, an effect. So as a scientist, where you're kind of interested in seeing what this thing is doing, what it could do for people, but at the same time you're kind of involved with like creating what you might call a supportive environment. And I'd just love to hear some of the ways the things you experimented with, maybe that didn't take, and then some of those things that really did, in fact, things that became, in a way, sort of almost not obligatory, but like fundamental aspects of the set and setting that are brought into these particular kinds of locations. Perhaps the rose being the best example in that one. But I'd just love to hear more about the protocols that you developed.
Well, the most basic thing in the set is what I like to call interpersonal grounding. That you have developed a relationship with someone you trust, and that you feel secure enough to welcome whatever experiences come into consciousness. There's not a need to control or censor or please anyone or avoid anything, So there's this total, insofar as it's possible to create that atmosphere, that's the primary goal in what is usually with us 8 hours of preparation before we give the drug to anyone. Then when that degree of trust and fundamental safety is established, in my experience, the setting does not influence the content of the experience significantly. It just makes you feel more safe. It's nice if it's aesthetically pleasing and confidential. But if you put different people in the same setting with the same preparation, or even the same person on different days with the same dose of the same drug, different content emerges. And the content is often very surprising. Sometimes there's imagery from cultures and traditions that are quite unfamiliar to the person who has received the psychedelic substance. And in my experience, I would say that is empirical support for Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, that I think we have enough data to consider that empirically validated.
And tell me the story of the rose. I really love that little detail in your book about it became at some point a sort of tradition almost to include a rose in the sort of setting room, and without whether or not that has any direct influence on the content of experience, it still seemed to me a very interesting a gesture that shows that in some sense you're doing more than science. You're creating an environment for something not to study, but to allow something else to happen. So where did the rose come from?
Right. I think the rose originated in Saskatchewan in the early research with LSD and alcoholism. But it has I think it has become a tradition in just about every center that has done psychedelic research. And it's usually a single red rosebud, sometimes with a little asparagus fern or baby breath with it. And it's always sitting there on the coffee table when the person comes in for the day, and we usually introduce the person to it. And then during the day, especially when someone first sits up from having been reclining, wearing an eye shade, stereophonic headphones, the experience is usually structured as an interior journey. But then it comes time to check in, to get up and go to the bathroom, stretch a little, explore the environment, look at some photographs, whatever. And when the person first sits up, we often invite them to just let their gaze rest on the rose, sort of like a brief meditation. And it helps the transition between the two realities, but it often is an incredibly beautiful experience in itself. At times, the rose is reported to unfold like in time-lapse photography, and there's a sense of diving deep into the center of the rose or becoming the rose, and sometimes there's this experience that we call external unity, of just feeling that you and the rose and all the rest of the universe are ultimately made up of the same energies somehow. And it's just a very beautiful experience to have in your repertoire. And then the person will go to the bathroom and come back, lie down, and continue their journey. And then at the end of the day, typically the research volunteer takes the rose home and shares it with the spouse, or dries it for future treasuring, or whatever they choose to do. But it's a nice symbol. And I often think of the way religions get started, that you can try to not adopt any particular religious structure, but you invariably start to develop traditions, and the rose is one of them.
Yeah, and another one is the playlist. I was incredibly happy, not only that you addressed the issue of music in psychedelic sessions throughout the book at various points, but that you also did us the favor of including the playlist or a playlist or a list from which you draw individual playlists at the back, and that was a very fascinating reading because this playlist is also like the Rose, not something that was one in a week. It was something that was developed over a long period of time, and that it propagates itself. I mean, I remember I had a conversation. I'm very interested in the question of music and mystical experience and psychedelic or otherwise. And I remember having a conversation with Robin Carhart Harris, who, of course, was involved in another one of the most significant psychedelic research projects within the last decade. And I asked him about music, and he says, well, we pretty much use Bill Richard's list. And so there's something about this being something, developed over time. And, we could talk about it in great detail. I can tell that you're an enormous music fan, especially for classical music, and it is dominated by classical music, by tonal classic music of the 19th century, Bach, Brahms. But I would also like to hear a little bit about maybe experiments with music that didn't work out, or how you learned, or what it was about the music that you ended up choosing, mostly very structured, developmental, composed Western music. What is it about those elements in the music that seem to support people's experiences the best?
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics. There's unlimited opportunities for research in music with psychedelics. And who knows what we'll consider the best in 10 years, But at this point, the playlist that's in the book and an appendix is what has emerged from decades of kind of trial and error with all kinds of different people, different races in education and degrees of physical health and different ages and so on. And in developing it, I often say the problem is to distinguish between the very good and the excellent, because in 6 hours, you can only use so much music, But some basic principles have emerged. And of course, this applies to high dose psychedelic work, where you're really getting beyond the ego for at least part of the session. And the principles are basically choosing music that provides a secure, dependable structure that has it's sort of like a trapeze artist's net, that if you don't need it, you forget it's there. But if you need it, it's immediately there, and it provides sort of a nonverbal support. It can kind of pick you up and carry you, sort of like a piece of driftwood floating in a river. And it's forward moving, it's strongly structured. There's no sudden surprises that are going to make you jump. We use a fair amount of choral music at times because there's something that seems very, perhaps it's maternal, supportive of the human voice. If you think of the human voice as simply another instrument in the orchestra. But it's not. We usually choose choral music in foreign languages because we don't want to engage the intellect of the person experiencing to try to follow the words, but just to allow the structure of the music itself to support and facilitate movement. And we do use a lot of, especially at the height of the experience, things like Brahms symphonies, the Brahms German Requiem sections, the Bach B minor Mass, etc., Barber's Adagio for strings, the second movement of the Brahms Violin Concerto. But we also use some of Russell Paul's Hindu music, very rhythmic, supportive, and again, dependable, reliable rhythms. We use a little percussive music of Guem, especially in the latter hours, how just percussion alone can be delightful. At the end of a session, when you're coming back, if it's been a basically positive experience, either spiritual or psychodynamic, I think you can appreciate almost anything. And at that time, if you have favorites, it's wonderful to listen to them, and it's kind of welcome back to the everyday world. But I think when consciousness is opening up and the ego is dissolving or being transcended, whatever words you want to use, it's really the structure of the music that counts. And I don't think that has anything to do with the usual preferences, either of the volunteer or the guide. It's something I would posit is intrinsic to the structure of the music itself.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that in your view or your experience, that it's the structure of the music rather than say it's timbre or its resonance. So while you do have some music that at least is inspired by Hindustani, either sacred or classical music, which of course is originally sacred music, a lot of people from the 60s forward have found the sound, the resonant sound of the drones in Hindu music, or the kinds of improvisatory flights of the sitar as being a very, now even kind of cliched model or organization or way of sort of navigating these spaces. It's funny you said how the music provides a net. And what it reminded me also was a title of one Grateful Dead record, which is Without a Net. And the Grateful Dead, of course, made a certain kind of musical journey that was both structured and in some ways unstructured and improvisatory, but also familiar, that became, for better or worse, the main musical environment for, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people's psychedelic experiences, some of which were probably stronger than they wanted them to be, and it's just a very interesting place, because I think that with music, and this was the point that I was making with Robin Carhart Harris, is that even if it's not necessarily directly influencing the content of the trip, the decision about music shows the way that whoever is the set, whoever's creating the setting, meaning, in your case, the decisions you make as the clinical staff who is attempting to support someone. People are going through difficult things. They're struggling with alcoholism. They're facing death. Heavy-duty stuff. But you're still making decisions, and those same kind of decisions are also made in the concert floor, in the psytrance rave out in the desert, where the people are aware that people are taking psychedelics, and they're trying to shape, engage, as I said, in better ways and in worse ways with the situation. But what I love about it is that the philosophies and the strategies can be so different, but they all show that part of what you're doing as the person setting the stage is constructing, is being involved in the construction of the experience itself. And so I guess my question for you, if you think about it, I'll just tell one story about an idea about music in one of these very different environments. When I went to Goa in India in the early 1990s, there was a electronic dance music scene there, and they would throw all-night parties. And these were very heavy people going to these parties, countercultural, psychedelic using, world travelers, spiritual seekers, but in that weird mixture of hedonism and spirituality that the kind of hippie generation sort of initiated. And I was talking to one of the main DJs who became very famous shortly thereafter, named Goa Gill. And he would talk about the way he and other people would structure the night, and they would include in their structure, in the sort of first third part of the evening, very dark music, heavy, scary, whatever, chaotic. Partly is in their view to break up the ego and to then be able to release it. And by the time you reach the morning, when they would play very serene, beautiful, exquisite kinds of music that's attuned to the dawn, they were sort of, that they had gone through their own thing. And so I guess one of the things that I think about is this question of how supportive versus sort of without a net, or scary or destructive or whatever. Whether you were in your experiences, did you ever play with more, let's say, rhythmically aggressive music, or chaotically music, or more like free jazz, something that was kind of wild and untamed, even if it was beautiful and still very spiritual? Or did you always sort of concentrate on classical music?
Oh, I think we probably tried everything over years. And, the consensus doesn't rule out the exceptions. For particular people, who knows what might be exceptionally meaningful or effective. We prepare people by telling them, if anything dark appears, kind of welcome it, go into it, explore it. It's like if it's some monster or demon or boogeyman of some kind emerges, you reach out for the hand of your guide if you need to, and you go towards it and you look it in the eye, and you essentially say, what are you doing in my mind? What can I learn from you? What are you made up of? And by confronting the frightening, the dark, there inevitably is insight and resolution. When it comes to, I noticed your word, to break up the ego, the way I have come to conceptualize it over the years is that the way the ego is best transcended is through unconditional love, acceptance, as opposed to attacking it. I think when you attack the ego, you tend to create depression. And the ego isn't the most important part of us, perhaps, but it has its own reason for being. And I guess it's coming from the whole Christian tradition that, egos are important, and they're worth caring for, and they're not the ultimate reality, but they have their place. And so the instruction to our volunteers is to just dive into, embrace whatever comes, no judging, no avoiding, and in and through, accept, confront, welcome anything in the repertoire of human emotions that comes up. And with that attitude, people often say, there really is nothing to fear. Mm. And then people report a real sense of integration and inner peace. But for that quality of experience to occur, there has to be really good preparation, and the person has to be really motivated to develop spiritual or psychological growth. That you're willing to suffer a little bit along the road.
Yeah, I think
meaningful.
Sure. I mean, I can see both of those elements as being really key, particularly their own motivation, because of course a lot of the time you're dealing with people who have who are there for a reason. They're having tremendous anxiety. They're facing death. They're dealing with alcoholism and other sorts of life issues, and so they're willing to make that ride. And I could definitely see why that would be extremely productive for a lot of people. But we have to take a break right now. I know we're going to have more questions than we're going to have time to deal with. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, and we're talking with Bill Richards about his new book, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics, and Religious Experiences. And we'll be right back.
The most news anywhere on the internet. ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com, your number one source for everything progressive.
Have you ever listened to Anthony Robbins, watched the movie called The Secret, or read about the power of positive thinking from the perspective of any of the many fine authors who have written about the subject? They all focus on the law of attraction, which governs every second of every life of every person in the universe. Like attracts like, and everything you do, feel, and think about as a regular way of being determines your life experiences. PRN's new show, LOA Today, explores all aspects of this magnificent law of the universe every Thursday evening from 7 to 8 p.m. Join hosts Walt Thiessen and Ioana June Thiessen as we explore the law of attraction each week. That's LOA Today, Thursday evenings from 7 to 8 p.m. here on PRN.
Hi, I'm Sandy Leon Best, host of Political Analysis. Welcome to the 21st century, where the corporate propaganda machine works 24/7 to manufacture your reality. Every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Political Analysis challenges the corporate narrative with independent news, analysis, and passionate conversations on the most critical issues of our time. Don't let the corporate echo machine become your truth. Tune in live to Political Analysis or visit the archives at prn.fm. If you like the show, rate us in iTunes. The Progressive Radio Network is moving forward, and we hope you are coming with us.
You are listening to PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Erik Davis. We're talking with Bill Richards about psychedelics and religious experience. One of the things I was surprised about with your book, Bill, is the amount and the degree of what I would call God talk in it, in the sense of really putting the perennialist case forward very strongly. Not sort of as simply a supporting way, oh, this is one perspective, but really putting forward the idea that what we're dealing with here, particularly in high-dose experiences, particularly when people have been able to courageously move beyond the ego, are kinds of experiences that for all intents and purposes are the same as or equivalent to the kinds of experiences that people have, not just within particular religious traditions, but more or less all of the major religious traditions in the sense of the Abrahamic traditions, as well as Hinduism and Buddhism. And at one point you say that that psychedelics are, quote, intrinsically sacred. So what I'd like to know for you, whether it's personally, whether it's because of the way that you read the evidence, or indeed even legally, because of course there are arguments that people make to be made that one of the best ways to protect the right of people to have access to these materials, which are clearly so helpful for so many people, as well as being insightful and sublime, but are also incredibly useful for people in deepening their lives and in their human flourishing, as you put it, that one of the best ways to kind of protect this access is to define it as a religious right, because at least in the United States we have religious exception clauses, and we can look at the way the Peyote American Church and the UDV are able to have access to these otherwise scheduled substances under a religious exception clause. So what I want to know from you is, like, what is it about you that's important, that's most important about insisting that these molecules are intrinsically sacred?
Well, that conclusion comes out of a lot of experience. We recently had a research volunteer who afterwards said, I'm a dedicated atheist, but I saw God, and I find that these incredibly, I call them sacred experiences. There's a sense of them being eternal outside of time, more real than this state of consciousness that we're usually in everyday living, incredibly beautiful. People describe it as homecoming or enlightenment or waking up or being totally accepted, remembering who they were before they were born, so on. That may all be poetic expression, but there's something that happens deep in the psyche that is incredibly meaningful. And it happens independent, I would say, of the person's expectation and religious education. The only people who have trouble in psychedelic sessions are either defiant atheists or defiant fundamentalists who kind of want to prove something, But a good old honest agnostic who is willing to collect new experiences and then think about them tends to do very well. Because the ego with its agendas needs to transcend itself or allow itself to move aside as these deeper dimensions of consciousness manifest themselves. And if you're trying to prove some point, it can get pretty scary and confusing.
Do you ever wonder, I'm sort of thinking about, what right now we can see the possibility of the kind of use of psychedelics that you have been involved in spreading, perhaps quite dramatically within, a few decades. We can imagine that scenario, looking at the story of cannabis, looking at the positive research, the return to research, the breakthroughs, and the sort of softening. So we can imagine that kind of future. And I guess what I'm thinking is that as we look at that future, how important is it for the future of psychedelic research of intentional use, psychotherapeutic use, or psychologically enhancing use? How important is it for that process to continue to bring in religious discourse, to talk about God, to talk about immortality, talk about the soul, versus a sort of more, I don't know what to call it, a lighter hand, one that is more open to, say, the secularism or the skepticism that so many people face. And I want to say this not just based on, an intellectual question I have for you, although it's a real question, but actually also because, in some ways I resonate with a somewhat different approach to psychedelics, which has its own kind of relationship with these sacred states and is certainly familiar with the zones of mysticism, but is perhaps a much more reticent about moving into God talk. Mm-hmm. And this, it's not just like a personal thing. It's like there's a lot of this material that's also there. And so it was very interesting for me reading your book where there were points where I would resonate and, say hurrah. And then there were other points where I would go, not so much for my own reaction, but because I could sort of feel the way all of these people that I've known in my life, courageous, spiritual, deeply, emotionally evolved people who have been part of my peer networks and my colleague networks for so long would go, that's a bridge too far. And so I feel like we're in this very weird place, which is a fascinating place to be, where the meaning of religion, the meaning of God talk is now intensified because these experiences are so profound or sacred, if you want, mm-hmm. but that also we can see again, some of the, I don't know, dangers or traps or considerations that we might have, or obstructions that are introduced when there's sort of too much, if you will, of an emphasis on religious language. And so I'm very just curious to hear how you see the role of not allowing for sacred experiences or even showing that they occur, which I totally agree, and we knew that back with Walter Pankey. Even if he didn't have a perfectly designed experiment, we knew that. But it's more the discourse, the way we talk about and integrate these things, whether religion can be in the way as well as being something that can illuminate. And I'll stop my little rant here with one quote that has never left me. Going back into the 60s, Ken Kesey was interviewed once about Leary and about the spiritual potential of psychedelics, and he had this line, which of course he didn't explain, but it stuck with me, where he goes, "Sometimes it can be worse to take it as a sacrament," and it's always stayed with me that there's something there too. And so I just love to hear you reflect on some of the role that you see religious language and religious texts and communities playing in this flourishing that I think we both agree we are involved in and are thoroughly in favor of.
Boy, I'm glad we have 3 more hours here.
I know, it's kind of mean. We only have 10 minutes.
What can I say here? These transcendental states of mind are so beyond language. And not only language, but the concepts that we usually think in. You know, it's beyond time and space and substance. And, you know, there's this line in the Tao Te Ching, the Taoist scriptures, "Those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know." And there's a certain wisdom there. And if you try to package it and say these are the words that describe it most accurately, I think you inevitably get into trouble. The word God is a wonderful word that has a lot of meaning and a lot of different meanings to different people, especially in different world religions. But it's a pretty decent word. It's one of those words like love that has a lot of different meanings to different people. But I can't think of any word that's better. But if you like the word God, that's fine. If you want to call it the Buddhist nothingness that contains all reality and ultimate paradox, that's fine. If you want to call it the nameless, that's fine, et cetera, that there are many different sounds we can emit in the air to refer to these profoundly beautiful states of human consciousness. My hunch is that their occurrence is at the very roots of many of, if not most of the world religions, and that it's people who experience these states, and we call them revelation when people experience them, often, and then they're expressed in what becomes scripture. And so I think this field is very important for religious scholars, that you don't just have to read ancient manuscripts in some dark carrel in a library to study mysticism, even in the original languages. But you could, in hopefully not a time not too distant, legally come to a psychedelic center, be medically screened if that's appropriate, well prepared, receive a pure drug in the right dosage, have skillful guidance, and be assisted in the initial integration of the insights that occur. And a religious scholar could experience those states and make his or her own conclusions about their significance and their meaning. Similarly, for a philosopher, if you really want to understand Plato, why not experience what Plato experienced? as a member of the Eleusinian mystery religions that used a sacrament that in all probability was a psychedelic substance. So there are huge frontiers, and my background is in both psychology and religion, and so in this book I've written, I'm trying to engage both religious scholars and the psychotherapy, drug policy, psychopharmacology communities, and invite dialogue between them.
Yeah, in the end of the book, you talk about that the Brecht play about Galileo, where he's got the telescope right there, and all the sort of authorities of the day refuse to look through the telescope because it's just too much. And I really hope that we're getting to a point, and we'll get to one soon, where there'll both be the institutional situation required, but also the kind of push, or maybe push is too strong. Well, no, I'll say push for people who are, for neuroscientists, for cognitive scientists, as well as for religious studies scholars, other people who work with the mind, where in a way it's kind of embarrassing to be making large statements about the nature of human consciousness or what possibilities exist for us without looking through these telescopes. I don't know if that's going to be happening anytime soon, but you certainly made a wonderful case for it. And again, I know we're running fast over all these great topics, but I also just had to say and to allow you to mention what to me is the most important part of all of this work, which is the role the psychedelics can play in helping people face death. Because in some ways, whatever we mean about religion or God or whatever that dimension of life means to us is all brought to a head through our mortality, and particularly through our imminent mortality, which we may sense even if it's decades off, but we don't know that, or whether we're, of course, have gotten a diagnosis of a terminal disease and we're sitting there and we're freaking out, and that's where it's all going to come to a head. And you do some very beautiful work. You have an incredibly moving part of your book where you talk about the death of your wife, and about how your reflections on how her ability to have a reasonably, quote-unquote, good death was partly due to her experience with psychedelics. That's my impression. Anytime psychedelic users that I know are wrestling with the mortal coil, I pay very close attention, because it's my strong belief that the one of the best things we can do to prepare for that inevitability or near inevitability for the transhumanists out there is to take psychedelics. So I would love to hear you say a little bit about, maybe even tell a story about what you've learned about death and the capacity for people to change their attitude towards death and dying through your work with psychedelics and end-of-life people.
Yeah, well, in the next few months, a major study is going to be published, actually two, one from Hopkins and one from New York University, using psilocybin with cancer patients. And I can say the results are very inspiring and positive. Repeating research we did back in the late 60s and early 70s, and doing it much more skillfully than before. But many of these cancer patients or people with terminal illnesses who have mystical experiences during psilocybin not only have a decreased experience of depression, anxiety, interpersonal relationship, or interpersonal isolation, preoccupation with pain, and so on, but they often report loss of a fear of death. And interestingly enough, that doesn't make them want to speed up death at all, but it enables them to live the time that's left more fully. And they view death more with curiosity than with fear. And there's a sense that somehow, ultimately, life makes sense in spite of the reality of death. And that's pretty profound. And I think the first legal application of psychedelics may well be in hospice care and perhaps palliative care. If it can really help people in the final chapters of their lives live more fully, this makes perfect sense. And it's not a drug you have to keep taking, because it's not the drug effect like taking Prozac or something that removes the depression, but it's the memory of the experience that occurs in one day or perhaps 2 different days of really exploring the antipodes of human consciousness. It's that inspiring memory that stays with people that seems to decrease the anxiety, depression, and help people live fully. And it happens with all kinds of people from different religious and non-religious backgrounds. So I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. That's where I also am putting my money on the sanity starting to emerge, and really like the kind of fulcrum for me, what it looks like to me is precisely these issues, which then can become expanded into other sorts of religious, psychological effects. But I think that it's the clear positive features in this zone that's going to bring us into a more sane regulatory environment. Although I must say, I always have to hold out hope that there's some way that you can keep a space for free thinkers alongside the religious specialists and the psychological specialists. But I just got to say, Bill, thank you so much for your book. It was really wonderful to meet you through the book and in this conversation. And you've done wonderful work over the years. And thanks for being with us on Expanding Mind.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Great. And once again, Bill's book is Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experience on, I think, Columbia University Press. So check it out. We'll be vacationing for the next couple of weeks, but we'll see you in January. And remember to keep your minds open.